pinche button.
Namaste.
चालू है. We are live, Meena.
Oh yeah, sorry.
We'll hear them live. We'll have a live musical session. So, but first of all, welcome to everyone who's here. Welcome to Tiedi's first live session on Instagram. So today we're here talking about secrets of the soil, and we'll also be taking you through the basics of composting at home. But first of all, let me just introduce you to the entire team here who's been locked down in the forest since the last 1 month. Okay, so we have Abhishek here. Hey. Okay, and we have Ankita.
Hey,
all our volunteers.
Yep.
Okay, we have Vishal here.
And the mirror is me.
Yay! And that's Rehman there.
That's Rehman. Yeah. Ranjita says hi to everyone.
Hey.
Yep.
All right, thank you guys. So let's start. And so secrets of the soil. So let's try and get deeper into the mysteries of the soil. And before we begin that, let me just tell you the story of Tieedi as to how it all began for us. When we started this project about 3 years ago, we looked at trying to clean up the place because we realized that there was a lot of waste in this place, and we wanted to have a cleaner surrounding, just like everyone wants to. So one of those things that we realized was there was a lot of organic waste that was going into the river or into other landfills. So we started learning about composting, and while doing that, we realized that this is something that, even though it's a very basic thing, unfortunately most people don't practice, but it's highly impactful in terms of, as an individual, it's one of those things that you can do that is the most revolutionary act towards fighting for climate change or towards becoming an eco warrior, right? So let's look at how or why the soil is misunderstood so far, right? So we call this whole subject, we've called it soilstry. So that's what we say for getting into the mysteries of the soil. Let's look at the first thing about soil. So we have soil here, and so this handful of soil, the interesting fact about soil is this handful of soil probably has more than the entire human population on this planet. And the soil is alive. So it has got more microorganisms in this particular handful of soil than the entire human population in this planet, right? So that's point one. Now point two, soil is something that can make you high. Yes, you can get high with soil. So there was a scientist who is an oncologist. I think Mary O'Brien, if I remember her name correctly. So when she tried to get this particular serum of bacteria, which is more popularly known as M. vaccae, and she tested it on her patients, and then she realized that this particular strain of bacteria, she wanted to test it for some other purpose, but she realized that it ended up making the patients very perky. It ended up making them happy. So there were some more tests done in it, and then people realized that when you smell earth, or when you smell soil, there is this chemical that's released in your body that makes you happy. Right? So soil is something that can get you high. Yes, you can get high in soil. So that's another mystery that we kind of realize here. And that's interesting because when we have people walk into a forest, or when we have people coming in here, a lot of people have talked about the fact that there is some shift in the energy. And we've been wondering what it was. So when we got to know about it, so that kind of clicked, saying that, okay, this is probably one of the reasons why. So that's point 2. Now point 3 about soil is that, the pure form of soil that is created by the forest, the natural soil, is something that takes time. So let's take a guess, right? You guys can type. So the question is, how long does it take for the forest to create, let's say, this is 1 inch of the soil. How long does the forest take to create 1 inch of the soil? Okay, so Saurav, who's behind the camera screen, will let us know. So guys, you can type in your answers. How long does the forest take to create 1 inch of soil, a pure natural forest soil?
Sustainable Indian says, yes, get high on soil all the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe one.
Hi, Nidoshana.
Prakriti's here as
Great
well.
to have you here.
Cool.
So do we have any responses?
No answers yet.
No answers yet.
Yeah.
So guys, the question is, how
6
long
weeks.
does
6
it
weeks.
take?
Akash Dayal says 6 weeks.
6 weeks. Okay, that's one
Spurti,
answer.
Spurti says a few weeks. Vikram Paryada says a year. And Adventure Sun Limited India says 1 month.
Okay.
Mega Sridhar 1 month. Wisdom Mobiles 1 month. Krika 6 months.
Okay.
Ghosh says 200 or more years.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's
3
good.
months, few months, something. Yeah.
Okay, so what's interesting is that when there was some research done on this particular fact, 1 inch of pure natural forest soil takes about 500 years. So it takes 500 years for nature to create soil in its purest form. Now, when you look at it, if it takes 500 years for the soil to be created, we have scientists even calling it now soil as a non-renewable resource, because it takes so much time for soil to be created. So that's another interesting fact about soil. Now, linked to this, do you know that in the last 150 years, we have more than half of our topsoil that's lost? Yeah, gone forever. Okay, in the last 150 years, we've lost more than half of our topsoil. And what's even more scary is that according to a report that was done by a United Nations backed study, in 2017, they stated that we probably have just about 60 more years before we run out of the topsoil. Now, if we don't have soil, okay, so let's see what we don't have. So we don't have soil, we don't have food that we can grow as we know it. We don't have forests, we don't have trees, and also what's interesting is that we don't have water, because what we realized in our short foresting experience out here is soil is the best place to store water. If you have a forest that can hold millions of liters of water, right? And we realized with our experience here when the river was dead, and we did a few permaculture experiences of building swales, of building a few dams, and then by the next year we started seeing the river trickle down even in the driest of the months, and realized that you can actually make soil hold water. And when soil holds water, it gives you water in its very purest form. So that is called mineral water when it comes out straight from the soil, right? But so if the soil is running out, if you're losing out this very precious resource, it's scary, right? So what do we do? I mean, how do we restore this balance? So to understand that, let's go a little into the basic science of what comprises or what makes soil. So just like our human body needs certain macronutrients and certain micronutrients, soil also needs macronutrients, and there are certain macronutrients that's defined by values called NPK. So that's nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. Okay. Oh, so Minal is here. Okay. Minal, so what is there? So if soil has NPK as a value, okay, nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium, let's see if you have to restore the balance in the soil, we need to start with restoring NPK, right? So Minal, what has a lot of nitrogen?
Urine.
Urine? Okay. So Minal says urine. Okay. All right. And what about P? What about phosphorus? What has a lot of phosphorus?
Poop.
Poop. Okay. Okay. He's a dirty boy. Okay. And what has a lot of potassium?
Potash.
Potash. Okay. He wants to burn the whole place down. Okay. So if we are to go by what Minal's logic is, and by the way, he's absolutely spot on. Your urine has a lot of nitrogen. Okay. Your poop has a lot of phosphorus. And there is a lot of potassium in the potash in its very natural form. So here and the reason why Vinil also probably stated is because we've been using a lot of our NPKs from our body to restore the forest here. But today, the talk is not about how do we go about peeing or pooping or burning down the trees or the forest to restore the balance in the soil. So can there be a better way? Right? So how do we get this macronutrients back into the soil? Right? How do we ensure that we become one of those eco warriors who helps the soil get back its carbon? So that, which brings me to another point, saying that see, this whole thing about carbon being an enemy, because we keep talking about there is a lot of like CO2 in the air, so carbon is cause of the pollution. But actually, if you look at it from an agricultural or a soil scientist perspective, carbon is something that is a friend. So carbon can be stored in 3 places. Okay, so let's look at where all so those are known as carbon sinks. So carbon can be stored in the atmosphere, right? Now we seem to have a lot of carbon, so that sink is usually kind of said to be full right now. Carbon can be stored in the ocean, but right now because there's a lot of leachates happening and we're losing out of the topsoil, there's a lot of carbon that has gone into the ocean. But there is one carbon sink that we have not yet tapped potential. The potential of that carbon sink or the soil to get in all the atmospheric carbon that is causing the pollution is tremendous. So again, there's a very interesting research that was done, and if I remember correctly, his name is Professor Mr. Rodale from University of Ohio, and he said a very interesting thing. So according to him, 2%, just a mere 2% increase in the carbon in our soil would result in capturing 100% of all the greenhouse gases that's there in the atmosphere. So if you're able to get in all the carbon back into the soil, okay, and if you're able to restore the soil's balance, the topsoil that we're losing out, then we are helping in fighting for climate crisis, because then you'll effectively be putting a brake on global warming. So again, that's a wrong term. We don't really call it warming anymore. Let's call it global heating, because it's kind of literally burning so far. So if you have to kind of slow down the temperature, you need to get the carbon into the soil. So if you go by Meadle's logic, okay, we need, like, you pee, poop, or you burn down the forest, get all the NPK together, and then your soil balance is restored. Or what do you do is, what can we do? Can we get some responses, guys? Okay, can we? Can anyone give some answers as to what do we do? So if that's the question as to how do we get that NPK values, or how do you restore the balance in the soil?
Composting!
So that's Tieedi for you. I mean, we look at composting, when every time someone says composting, it's almost like a festival time for us, because for the last 3 years we've been composting. We've been
we have our first answer. Vikram says compost food.
Okay.
Sustainable Indian says somewhere. Do mention the books one can read, and okay, we'll come back to it. We are recording the session. Sustainable Indian, everyone can, and
Compost
so,
toilet.
we will get back to you with all the reference of the books. We will let you guys know all the research papers and all of that. We'll give you guys links later.
Hena Bhupta says manure, and yes, Jan Divan say compost toilet, which is also
So,
those
so
are the
he's
answers.
Meadle's friend. Yeah.
Oh.
he wants compost toilet. So
Yeah.
that's a good answer too. Compost toilet is one of the big revolutionary things that you can again do. But yeah, composting is a big thing. So our composting journey also has been very interesting. So when we decided to compost, we did not know how to compost, but we decided to compost the entire village's waste. So we started getting almost like about 100 kgs from the village, and we started digging pits, and then but we couldn't compost. And we went through a very steep and a bumpy learning curve before we figured it out. And we've been composting now for the past 3 years. I think the last time that we calculated, we had composted close to about 100,000 kgs from the entire village and also other areas. We've installed a composting unit in schools, we've installed composting units in monasteries, and now in the last couple of months before the lockdown, we had started installing composting units at homes. And we started this home composting units where we came up with a catalyst that makes composting as easy as boiling water. Yes. So, but if you look at composting, what generally happens is there is some amount of resistance that comes in. Okay, there is some amount of hindrance. Okay, and in a typical household, composting does not happen, even though people are very well-meaning. They know composting is right, but somehow composting does not happen. Okay, so let's see why composting does not happen in a household. Okay.
It's all stinking. What are you doing?
Oh, I'm just trying to compost.
Everywhere there are flies everywhere.
Oh, I know what to do. It's stinking so bad that I'm scared to go near the pit as well.
Yeah. Are you supposed to compost at home?
I think this is how it is done, and this all we use like.
Utsav, will you tell us about this thing? How to compost at home?
What happened? What's the problem, guys?
So
I'm
she's
trying to compost,
Okay.
and everyone is complaining that it's stinking bad, and there are flies everywhere, and it's really getting bad.
First of all, kudos to you that you want to compost at home, and so there are flies and it's smelling. So does that seem like a common problem? So a lot of people have kind of messaged us on Instagram saying that okay, compost is smelly or it's too much soggy, and there's so many flies that come in. So composting, if done right, there is no smell, and in fact, at the end of it all, what you get is something that makes you high.
Really?
So just smell this, huh?
Smells
This is
nice.
Yeah, perfect.
okay. You guys have got your dose of I. Thank you very much.
Cool.
So, isn't that what happens in every household?
Speedy says exactly.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
that's the
that's
word.
exactly what happens,
Yeah.
right? When you look at it, someone's trying to compost, it does not happen. And
Everyone is coming, yes, for the smell part.
so trust us. So imagine, so if you are trying to compost at home, the amount of smell that came in. Now we are trying to compost the entire village's waste. So we had like hundreds of kgs coming in every day,
Yeah.
and we went through the exercises of smell. We went through the similar experiences of flies and all of that. So that's a story for another day as to what happens. But we went through the learning curve, and we realized that if you do it right, if you keep in mind certain things, it does not smell. And within 3 months, you get stuff that gets you high, right? And stuff that with which you can grow your own food too. Okay, so we have got ingredients here to show you guys how to compost. Before that, I've noted down a couple of things to understand why we should compost, because it's important to understand why first before we understand how do we compost. Okay, so one of those primary things that composting does is it helps restore the depleting topsoil, and it's a very revolutionary act, because if all of us compost, and remember the stats that we told you earlier, 2% rise in the carbon level of the soil will ensure that we will be able to offset 100% of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So imagine a time where none of us throw this so-called thing as waste and give it to someone else, and it gets dumped. Because, let's be honest about it. In case of waste, there is no such thing as a way. You may think that you've kept your house clean by putting things in the dustbin. You may think that you've kept your society clean by putting things in the respective dustbin and then calling the waste pickers, the truck, whatever, at the right time. You may think your municipality is doing the right thing by keeping the city clean, but where does all this waste go, right? So, and ultimately it gets mixed. So when things get mixed, it does not get composted, and if it does not get composted, if the whole mix is not right, then what happens is it ends up releasing a lot of methane in the atmosphere. Now, if methane is released, it's a greenhouse gas that's 20 times more potent than your carbon dioxide. So that means if you do not compost and you're giving your waste to a place that it goes into a landfill or your nearby dumping place and it's not getting composted, so then it's releasing methane, which is causing more pollution, right? So if we compost, you are able to. Okay, so there's someone here. Okay. Snowy, come. Okay, she's a little shy. Okay.
Oh yeah. Okay.
I thought we'll introduce you guys to one of our members of the Tieedi family, but Snowball's run away. But anyways, so coming back to composting, it helps you restore the topsoil. The other interesting thing is what we realized was, and when we did the calculation, you will be able to save at least about 20,000 rupees or about $500 to $1,000 every year if you just compost your household waste. So let's take an example and see how that works. Do we save money while composting? How does that work? I mean, you can understand the part of getting high with compost, but saving money, that seems a little far-fetched. Okay, but so let's take an example. All of us, especially in India, we use coriander while cooking. Now, while buying coriander, we pay about 10 rupees per bundle, right? And every household would be using at least about 2 bundles of that coriander that we go and buy from a nearby vegetable vendor. Now, so that's 20 rupees in a week, and that amounts to about 80 rupees in a month. So that's about 960 rupees in a year, which is almost about 1,000 rupees in a year, just with coriander, if you compost and grow your own coriander. Now, similarly, think about the other vegetables that you can grow and the cost of the other vegetables that's there, especially if you're having organic vegetables, right? So if you compost and are able to grow your own vegetables, that means you would be saving a lot of money. So our calculation was about 20,000 rupees that you save in a year. The other thing about compost is you can not just save, you can earn money, because anyone who is into gardening and anyone who loves flowers or anyone who's bought compost from the market knows that a good quality compost from a trusted source would cost no less than in India about $1 a kg, or about 50 rupees to about 100 rupees, and sometimes even up to 200 rupees. They call it vermicompost, and they give them fancy names. They call it nutrient rich, enriched with this, enriched with that, and they sell you a compost. Sometimes I've seen people buy compost for about even 200 rupees a kg. So if you have your own compost, you can even earn money. So like a very recent example, we had installed a composting unit at OKC Monastery in Darjeeling, and so they have harvested, so this is the 3rd time that they're harvesting compost, and because we are needing some amount of compost to prepare the catalyst, we ended up buying compost from there. So I think we bought about 200 kgs, right? So they ended up earning about 20,000 rupees or 30,000 rupees for the amount of compost that they would be selling to us. So even at your home, if you don't want to grow your own food, you can actually sell your compost to people who are into home gardening. And so that's the other thing. And you can help the recycling industry by composting your food waste, because let's be honest about it, right? The reason why we don't like going nearby a landfill, or we don't like going into dumping chutes or nearby dump yards, or even nearby our own dustbin, is because we don't like the smell, right? But you know what? What's smelly is actually the good stuff. What's smelly is actually stuff that wants to become soil. What's smelly is stuff that actually wants to fight climate crisis and wants to get into the soil as carbon. But because we are locking it in plastic, it is not able to become soil. So that's when it becomes soggy, and that's when ammonia gets released into air, and that you get that very putrid smell that kind of makes you feel a little nauseous. So what you do when you compost is that you help the recycling industry. So let's do a very small thought experiment. Let's imagine that you're walking by a landfill, okay, or a dump yard that has no biodegradable matter there in it. So if there is no biodegradable matter, that means there is only stuff that is either plastic, or metal, or certain stuff that has been thrown away, that has kind of has had its life cycle. So then what you do is you go into that particular place. Now think about it, guys. It's a thought experiment. Then you look at that place, think about it again. There is no smell. So you actually look at that place and you think, oh, that's something probably that I need. Or that's something that, you know what, that would fit perfectly into that particular place. So that particular landfill stops becoming a landfill or a dump yard, and now it starts becoming what we call an MRF, or a materials recovery facility, right? So if you start composting at home, there will be no landfills, okay? And if there are no landfills, you can actually convert all of that into playing fields for like our children, or parks, because you get all of that huge amount of land spaces that's currently occupying huge amount of very valuable real estate, because we're just dumping waste there. Right? So composting helps you restore the places, the things in the right place by giving the recycling industry a chance to recycle things like plastic or whatever that can be recycled, and things like metal and even clothes. So old clothes can go back into the recycling industry. Now, the other thing that generally happens is that we tend to kind of forget that there is a human being who comes and takes our waste. In times like this, collecting waste, even during a lockdown, is considered as an essential service. So even though we are not going out because we care for our health, but there is someone who probably is coming to our homes, collecting our waste, putting their lives at risk, and then taking our waste probably to a landfill or wherever the processing center is. Okay, so they are humans, we are humans too. So their lives are as precious as our lives. Right? So, and unfortunately, we do not give them much respect, and they are probably the most downtrodden section of our society, and their jobs is something that they find very demeaning. So you'll find a lot of these people just trying to go by the day by like getting intoxicated because they just can't stand the smell. And so if you compost at home, that means you are helping certain sections of the people to get a lot more respect in their lives. Okay, so those are what we call the whys of composting, why you should compost, right? So all those reasons are pretty powerful in their own ways, and why you should compost is something that apart from getting high, you get high with composting, but apart from getting high, so there are like a number of reasons why it helps the earth become a better place. So let's try and see how do we compost, right? So we have certain ingredients here, right? So, Saurav, can you zoom in a little?
Have a look.
So we have all the fruit peels, we've got like eggshells, right? And when we're talking about composting, and composting at home, we're talking about getting everything composted. So there is no such thing as you can't compost garlic or you can't compost citrus peels, or we have let's say the kitchen. Minal, where's the okay? Here. So let's say if this is our kitchen bin, just came down, and let's say so all of this. So it's got everything that's, so you have tea leaves, you have like leftover food, rice, vegetable peels. So everything that's biodegradable goes into a compost bin, right? And what we have here is things that help it compost and things that's again biodegradable. But let me just explain as to how this whole thing works, right?
There's someone asking about the cooked food. Can you add
Yes, you can.
onion peels?
Onion peels, cooked food, everything that's biodegradable can go into your compost bin. Okay. Now, there are a lot of people who have a concern with adding meat. Okay, but we've been adding meat and bones into our compost bins. You need to be careful about meat, where sometimes if you don't have a bin that's strong enough, you might attract rats. So that's something that you need to be careful about. A lot of people have this confusion about cooked food or about citrus peels, because certain times when people are trying to compost, someone has told them about vermicomposting. So worms don't like certain food, so you don't put that certain food there. But the question that we had was, if you don't put that food in the compost bin, so where do you put that, right? So our system of composting is, you put everything into the compost. Everything that's biodegradable should go into your compost bin, right? And what we also do is, if you have like leftover meat or bone pieces, you can actually feed it to the street dogs that's there, right? So you can actually boil the whole thing up, clean it up, or you can just go and feed it to the animals, the stray animals that's there. So if you look at composting, you got to be aware about just about, like, let's say 3 or 4 things. Okay, so just to understand the basic science about composting, so that because if you get it right, if you understand this basic theory about composting, then you know where you're going right, or then you know how do you correct certain problems that you encounter. So one is when you're composting, you're getting nitrogen into the picture, right? So apart from what Minal said has nitrogen, all your vegetable peels or your cooked food, all your greens that you've cut, right, has a lot of nitrogen.
Question
Yes.
about watermelon peel, paper. Is paper considered as a wet waste? Fish bones can be composted, and yeah. How to know what's biodegradable and non-veg waste?
Okay, so this whole thing about wet waste and dry waste, I think it's confusing. So I think the right way to term waste would be whether it's biodegradable or non-biodegradable. Okay, so wet waste and dry waste is, I would consider it as a municipality term, because they would want, okay, the wet waste to be taken separately and dry waste to be separately, and we end up sometimes keeping paper into the dry waste, because paper is, let's say, but paper is a biodegradable waste. So what happens to the dry waste? And if only the wet waste is composted. So let's look at it as biodegradable waste. That includes paper, cardboards, all food that is decomposed and everything, right? So if you look at biodegradable waste, it has your fruit peels or your leftover food has a lot of nitrogen. So that's point one. Your anything that's dry or brown in color, so like let's say the coconut husk, okay, or cocoa peat has a lot of carbon, okay, or even like let's say this coir rope, and if you are using the Indian broom, so this has also got a lot of carbon. Your leaves, this has also got a lot of carbon, okay. Paper, okay, so paper has also got a lot of carbon. Okay, so now that we know that there are certain things that's got nitrogen, there are certain things that's got carbon. Nitrogen is something that decomposes quickly, so that's the one that's releases smell. In fact, so much so that we've got this little guy here. Okay, even he's got his eyes closed. Okay, because probably he's here with the vegetable peels that's there. Okay, but let's see if we can open up his eyes and let's see how do we get all of this together. So you have nitrogen and then you have carbon. Now, to get these two guys together, what you need is you need moisture and then you need air, right? So if you need moisture, you have a lot of moisture content. So this is probably about 70% water, right? So, and this has got very less quantity of water in the carbon side. So when you're composting, what you do is you add equal amounts of nitrogen or materials that has nitrogen with equal amounts of carbon, right? So let's say if I have to do that, what I do is, so let's say if this is my home composting unit, so this is a khamba that we had partnered with our this wonderful company from Bangalore called Tieedi, and we've been manufacturing it here and we've been installing it in homes. So let's say if you have to compost it, so what we do is you take a bunch of these and so let's say you take even whatever is from your kitchen, and let's say you add all of that here. So that becomes like a layer of nitrogen. So if you've got a layer of nitrogen, you need to ensure that there is a layer of carbon that goes to balance it out. Okay, because now this will start decomposing quickly. It'll start releasing a lot of water, which is also known as leachate. So that's the part that gets soggy. So what you do is you add carbon. Okay, so we're adding carbon here. Okay. So that becomes like a layer of nitrogen and carbon. So in all of this, so think of the whole thing of composting as a jigsaw puzzle, right? So if you're trying to solve the jigsaw puzzle, you need sometimes a helping hand, right? So it could be your best friend, or you can look at it also as someone who speaks the language of nitrogen, carbon, someone who knows how to talk the language of air and water in terms of knowing what is the right kind of right amount of moisture that is required. So we call this guy the catalyst. Okay, so sometimes when you can't solve a jigsaw puzzle, you need a friend's help. Or when there are multiple people trying to kind of have a conversation and they can't speak in the same language, you need someone who is an interlocutor, right? Someone who can speak all the language. So a catalyst could be certain items that's got high microorganisms in that, right? So this is a catalyst that we've prepared at Tieedi. Okay, so this is like we've been researching on a catalyst since the last couple of years before we finally launched this. So this has a number of ingredients, but one of those very interesting things that's there in the catalyst, so it looks something like this, right? So this is got what we call indigenous microorganisms from the forests of Tieedi. So when you kind of do it in your home, when you kind of do composting in your home composting unit, you add nitrogen, you add carbon, and then you sprinkle a little bit of catalyst. Right? So every time that you do that, you just sprinkle a little bit of catalyst. So that helps solve the jigsaw puzzle that's going on there. Now, what if you don't have catalyst? Right? A lot of people would say, okay, you're sitting at home, you've got the nitrogen, okay, you figured it out in your head, you've got the carbon, but where do you get the catalyst from? Okay, so what you can do is you can prepare your own form of catalyst, right? We feel Tieedi catalyst is something that cannot be kind of copied or that cannot be kind of duplicated because it's very potent. Yeah, it's like we said, I mean, if you had our catalyst, it's just like as easy as boiling water. So, but what do you do if you want to prepare your own catalyst? And even if it takes longer, it helps you compost. So what you do is, to prepare your own catalyst, you get anything that's got high microorganisms in that. So this is a well-finished compost, right? So like I said, it smells really, really good. So this is like dark soil, a compost that's already done. So if you don't have a catalyst, a well-finished compost also acts like a catalyst. So what you can do is, you can add compost that you already have into the whole mix there. Right? So, but then you might think that, okay, what if I don't have, I've never done any gardening. What if I don't have any compost that's already there? So the other option that is there is, Minal, get me some phosphorus.
Oh, yeah.
Until then, there's one question by Hemenway. Any DIY alternative for compost bins, and if you can elaborate on how people...
Yes, we will show you the other versions of it also.
Okay, and Sustainable Indian has a question. What's your view on composting with soil? Due to lockdown, I'm having an unused soil from the garden mixed with some amount of ready compost.
Okay, so we'll cover those questions too. So this guy is phosphorus. Okay. So, Minal, is this your phosphorus?
No.
Okay. This is thankfully not Minal's phosphorus. It's from the village that we have. So, we have a neighbor who's got cow. So, we get this supply of cow dung, which is excellent in terms of acting as a catalyst. So, you can just add a little bit of cow manure, and so that acts like a catalyst. And now, if you don't have cow manure, what you also do is you can get a little bit, and you don't have compost. So what you do is you get a little bit of soil from, Sustainable Indian has said that what if you don't have compost? What do you have? Soil. So you can get a little bit of soil. If you can, then try and get a little bit of dry leaves or fallen leaves, and then you can add into it. Right. So this acts like a catalyst. And so the other day when I'd gone to my aunt's place, we wanted to add some catalyst, but we didn't have any. So what we did is we went to the terrace and then we looked around. So like they say, permaculture is all about what you say as protracted observation, right? So you try and observe things in a very different way, in a very protracted way. And we saw that she feeds a lot of pigeons in her terrace. And then we looked around and we traced the pigeons' phosphorus. And then we picked it up. Okay, and then we added it into a compost bin. So if you just look around, you could get stuff like this. So this is chicken poop. Okay, so it could be your pigeon poop that's coming into your balcony. So you can have, you can invite the pigeons there. You can feed some of the birds, and then they might leave some catalyst for you. So this acts like a catalyst, right? So this can also go in. So you similarly, anything that acts like an activator. So let's say you don't have all of that. Since a long time in India, we've been kind of having curd, right? So curd also has bacteria that aids composting. So what you do is just take a spoonful of curd, add onto it. Okay, so you've got the nitrogen part figured out, you've got the carbon part figured out, you've got the catalyst, your best friend for the compost, figured out. Now you just need to ensure water or moisture and air is right. So you need to ensure that your compost bin is well aerated, okay, and you need to ensure that there is just about enough moisture. So how much water should be there? So in terms of water, I think, so let's imagine this as a sponge, right? So it's an acre, again carbon, but just think of this as a sponge. So the amount of moisture that should be there in a compost bin is, if you dip it in water and there is like, it's soaked in water and you kind of squeezed it out. So the amount of moisture that should be there in a compost bin is equivalent, or in terms of similarity, would be a well wrung out sponge. So all the water is gone out, but still wet, right? So it should be that much. And your vegetable peels and all the food waste, all of that would anyways release water. So you need not do any extra addition of water, except when you feel that it's dry, right? So just sprinkle some water when it's dry. Okay, now, and then you need to aerate it. So what if you don't, let's say, have a khamba, right? So if you look at it, what if you have to do things at home, right? So we have a composting unit that we've made using an old, I think it's a paint can or a Fevicol can. So what you do is you get any bin. So it could be even this bin, which is like a dalda bin, right? So similarly, what you do is
we are interested.
This is like a DIY.
Yeah.
So this is like a paint can. So what you do is to aerate it, you kind of punch holes all around. Okay, so we got it perfectly because it just sits perfectly like that.
These are
And
holes.
yeah, these are the holes so that the aeration happens. So similarly, you keep adding stuff here and then it fills up. What we do is to ensure that, so this is just to ensure that it's easier. If you lack of space, then you can stack it up front. If you don't want to stack it up, you can be individual units. Because we could stack it up front, we've got holes here too. Okay, so here, okay, so any leachate from here goes down. Okay, now if you don't have like an option where you can stack, if you just got any bins, like let's say even a tin or whatever, you need not have holes at the bottom. Even if you have holes at the bottom, just ensure that you collect that leachate. That's very potent nitrogen fertilizer. You can dilute it 1:10 or 1:15, water it, give it to your plants. They would love it because it's a very potent nitrogen fertilizer. But you need not to do that. What you could also do is, let's say this is what you have. Just ensure that there is like a very thick layer of carbon here. So if there is any leachate that's going out, that goes to carbon, that will soak all of that in. So again, you need to have a layer of nitrogen carbon. So first layer should always be carbon. So you have a very thick layer of carbon that soaks in all the leachate that's going in there. Now if you don't have that layer of carbon, generally what happens is that's when you get the smell, right? And that's when the flies get attracted to it, because if there is smell, the flies get attracted to it. But if you have carbon soaking in all the smell, then you don't have flies getting attracted to it, and your composting is happening really. So this is another example of carbon. So this is like a straw that is there, and let's say some more examples of carbon would be your straw, and you can have like shredded paper, old notebooks that's shredded. Just ensure that you don't add any plastic in there. So just peel off the plastic if there is any plastic. It could be like in your homes you might have like, let's say, certain boxes that come as packaging unit. You can ensure that you take off the plastic, and then that can become your carbon source. Okay, so once you do all of that, what happens is you got the composting thing sorted, right? Now, if this bucket is filled up, okay, what you do is you either have an option where you can transport it somewhere and kind of let that be the storage unit, or you can let this bucket itself be the storage unit where you keep it aside, right? And then you start off with the other bucket that is there. Now, how much time does it take to compost? Usually, in, let's say, climates that's got that's neither too hot or neither too cold, in a very pleasant climate, I would say it would take about 3 months for your all of this to get converted into this. Okay, now we are pretty conservative in that, even though you might have a lot of people say that, okay, we've got this machine that can give you a compost in 24 hours, just put it in your machine, churn the wheel, or just in most cases like turn on the switch and then you get, that's not compost, right? If nature takes 500 years to make natural forest soil, we could at least wait to make compost at least for 3 months, because if you use compost that is not matured, your plants will not do too well. So you need to let your the whole jigsaw puzzle or the whole game to go on for about 3 months before it becomes soil. Okay, now within 45 days you would probably see things decomposing, and you might even be tempted to use it, but we would still say keep it aside. You know, but another interesting thing about composting is, if you take a bucket that's full, right, you look at it after like 45 days, it would have become half. Come back after 3 months, the entire compost would have become soil, and it would occupy just about 20% of the space. So your household would generate 300 kgs of waste every year, excuse me, and that will get converted into soil or compost. That's about 80 kgs. So that's another thing about composting, where the tremendous amount of volume reduction that would happen, right? So we talk about 1 second.
352.
Yeah. So we also now look at what are the problems of composting, right? And what do we do when those problems occur, right? Or if you're trying to compost, like Ankita was trying to compost, and then Abhishek did not like the smell. Now, if Ankita has to kind of get rid of the smell, what does she do? So, if it's smelly, that means there is too much of nitrogen. What you do is you need to add a little more of the carbon, right? If you've got a catalyst, add a catalyst so that the whole jigsaw puzzle starts fitting in really well together. But if it's smelly, add carbon. If it's soggy, add carbon. Now, if your composting is not happening, right? So there is, things are not decomposing, it's too dry. You need to add a little bit of nitrogen. Now, when all of this happens, where your composting is going on at a perfect rate, you would wonder that you've created compost. Now, what do you do? Like, let's say you don't have time to kind of give to your plants, or what do you do with the compost? So, like we said earlier, the earth needs that compost. It needs that carbon to go back into the soil. Just go out and feed the trees in your locality. Just go out and feed the plants in your locality. So they would love it. And next time, probably when you're walking by your avenue, you'll probably see a tree bowing down one of its branches just for you because you added compost. Right? So when you compost, like we said, we started off with this guy closing his eyes and saying that, okay, he does not want to talk about composting. It could actually end up as such that composting will ensure that he might open his eyes and there might be like a tree. So yeah, so composting opens even the eyes of the enlightened ones.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so
We have a lot of questions.
A lot of questions. Yeah.
So what we do is we've got the question hour session, but before that, do you guys want to see how a forest soil looks like? Do you guys want to have a peek into a forest?
Yeah.
So come on, let's have a look.
all go.
Now ready. All right. So, guys, this is Tieedi, the forest land. So this is where we live, and this is the pathway, and it's a natural stone pathway, stone and mud. And we talked about the river drying out when we came in here. So what we did was, when we carved out this pathway, and it's a very steep landscape that we have, right? So when you carved out the pathway, we did not have any cement that went in here, any concrete that went in here, because we wanted to have a pathway as a water reservoir. So how that works is, anytime there is rainfall, otherwise rain or the water would have rushed down into the stream and it would have gone off. So right now what happens is, when it rains, it kind of, you see all of this humus here, it's got a thick layer, so it kind of, this smells divine. So we've spread a lot of, apart from the tree giving us its leaves, the dry leaves, we spread a lot of hood shavings here, or sawdust here, that we got as free. So it was from a carpenter store, untreated hood, that we kind of just spread it here. Now that becomes the humus. Okay, that gets, so we end up using it once in a year. We go to a vegetable garden, the kitchen garden that we have, and then we add this, and so this helps us stop the flow of water, or rather pause it for a while. So once it hits here, it kind of percolates into the soil and then it goes down. It's pretty misty today, so we probably are not able to show you the earthy dwelling down there, but if you guys, I'm not sure if you can see the bridge down there. So that's the bamboo bridge that leads to the earthy dwelling. And then one of the structures that you see at the top, this is the it's a permaculture technique called brush hood, where any place that you see there is a lot of runoff happening of the topsoil, so we kind of build this structure so that your topsoil is kind of captured there. Okay, and then you can plant trees on that, so that becomes an extremely a fertile region. So wherever we see that there is a runoff happening, we kind of add that, and so that's Tieedi for you guys. So if you can hear some of the birds, yeah, so they're pretty much of an orchestra most of the time, but probably because it's misty today, so can't hear them much. Okay, so okay, let's go back and let's see what these guys are up to. So what you see here is the what we call air dwelling, and you have this whole structure made out of bamboo and mud, and we call it an air dwelling because it's projected on air. And so that's done by one of our volunteers, Antonia. So Antonia, if you're here, we miss you. And so she came up with this wonderful design where it's golden ratio that follows the Fibonacci series, or a spiral that kind of explodes into a tree. So so that's where we kind of end today's session. So we would like to take in your questions. So the next part would be that we try and answer whatever questions that we have. Okay, so let's go back in.
Okay.
These guys are still playing.
Is a time when no such thing as waste. No thing as waste.
No such thing as waste.
Only things going out of place. Things going out of place. There's no
Thank you
such
guys.
thing as waste.
Thank you for being part of this session. And you guys can bring us questions, and we would kind of be happy to help you guys. But let's start composting. Let's start restoring the topsoil, and let's all